Welcome for some more affordable fixed blade content. We've been looking at a lot of Scandi ground knives lately, most recently Ukrainian-made knives, starting with BPS and then moving on to BeaverCraft. In the last review, we took a look at the BeaverCraft BSH1, the knife that they call the Dune. It's an awesome knife. I really like it. But today it's time to take a look at, well, let's kind of call it its little brother, the BSH2, which they call the Glacier. But I'm going to say design-wise, it's more than just a smaller version of the BSH1. Let's go ahead and talk about the sheath. If you've seen the video I did on the BSH1, some similarities here, including some of the general differences I'm seeing between BeaverCraft and BPS sheaths, where with BPS I was getting that one-size-fits-most sheath that you could buy separately with and without a ferro rod in a couple different colors. But that sheath, even though it was made out of a very robust leather, wasn't sized for any particular knife. Sometimes that worked just fine, and sometimes, well, it really didn't. Whereas with BeaverCraft, I am seeing sheaths that are sized for the individual knives. Yes, they do come with a thinner and more supple leather than that one-size-fits-most BPS sheath. But some of the upsides versus the downsides of that, well, the leather did come to me kind of dry. I slathered on some leather conditioner, which also darkened the color, but I feel like that thinner leather does conform better with break-in to the individual knife. However, there might be a concern with durability, since it's not a really thick leather. Am I a little bit worried that one day I'm going to make a sloppy resheathing and accidentally stick that really keen tip through the side of it? Yes, and I've had to be cautious about that so far. Haven't had that kind of accident. But one of the other upsides of the thinner leather is, well, it's lighter and takes up less room than that thick, chunky sheath in a pocket, in a pack, or even if I wanted an alternate carry system and I just wanted to wedge it into a waistband. But speaking of carry systems, yes, you're getting a belt loop and a dangler that is removable. You're also getting a sheath where about half of your grip is fitting down nice and secure inside of it, but still leaves me plenty of real estate, assisted by the shape of the grip, to give me a positive deployment. So overall, yeah, I'm really kind of liking what BeaverCraft is doing with their sheaths. Time to talk about the friendly end, and yes, we're going to compare it to the one because they do have a lot in common, but also some key differences, some of them actually surprising. But let's start with in common walnut scales connected by 2 screws to full tang, and BeaverCraft does recess their screw heads into those grip scales so they're not sticking out. Both grips appear to have a recurve and flared profile, but the one is certainly more extreme in both of those dimensions, including a recurve that continues into the profile of the blade and that flare into what I'm going to call a horse's hoof shape. Not nearly as pronounced on the two. That blade geometry is a lot straighter at the spine. It's not recurved forward, and as you can see, the terminations into a round butt. But I feel like the flare is certainly sufficient enough for hand retention. Both have these really big lanyard holes that I'm not using because I feel like the grip is really good at, well, retaining my hand. And that includes in the sheath when half of the grip is covered inside the sheath. I only have to grab onto. I still feel like that flare gives me enough, kind of grabs my hand back for positive deployment. Also, like the one, there is a bit of a finger choil guard here at the top to keep my hand from sliding up into danger, but the one definitely has a more extreme angle on that. We'll see how this one works in the performance testing. The number 2 also has some very interesting shapes here at the top of the scales, has that same clean transition on the back so I can get my thumb up on the spine and know there's no jimping, something I'll probably add later. Speaking of things I add, just like on the number 1, came to me with the scales rounded front to back, flat on the sides for indexing, and I went ahead and just kind of smoothed out those transitions for my own taste. But here's where things get a little interesting in terms of perception. Obviously, the blade on the 1 is longer. The overall length is longer. Does that mean the grip on the 2 is smaller? Functionally, no, it's not. First of all, as you can kind of see, especially how narrow the 1 gets up here, the 2 is a lot girthier. It's a lot more hand-filling, so feels very different in hand as compared to the 1. We'll definitely talk about how that comes into play in performance and handling. But even functional length, yes, the grip on the 1 is longer, but if I'm measuring point to point in the front, that's the same 4 1/4 inches, 10.5 centimeters. So medium with hands pretty much fill that space. However, because of the difference in the grip shape, it gives me, well, let's call it the illusion that I have more room on this grip as compared to where the grip of the 1 kind of terminates very sharply on me. So yeah, very different hand feel. And after we talk about performance and handling, including martial handling, I'll tell you which grip I like better and for what. Before we talk about the blade, how much did I pay for the thing? When I got it on Amazon, I'll put the link down in the description, it was going for around $38 US, surprisingly $5 more than the number 1 for a smaller knife. And for that, yes, I'm getting another 1066 high carbon steel blade that my test files are saying somewhere around 57, 58 HRC, which is as they advertise it's supposed to be. And this steel has proven itself to be impressively durable so far. But it is very easy to stain, especially with this. Well, I'm not going to call it a mirror finish because I can still see the scarring of the sanding belt, but I may just go ahead and put a patina on it, probably about the same time I add a little jimping for my own preference. Now, some difference in not only dimensions and shape to the blade, but let's talk about overall weight. 5.4 ounces, 153 grams, so it is a little bit lighter than the number 1, with a point of balance that is about 1/2 inch, 1 centimeter further back into the grip, just below the grip screw. And we'll talk about that in handling, probably because there's more wood down here in the grip and less blade. But speaking of which, all right, you've got kind of a straight clip point here. As I mentioned, it's a straight profile versus being recurved forward. Scandi grind, that does get steeper towards the tip for lots of reinforcement. And one of the things you're going to see between the 2 knives is the number 1 has a much more acute tip. We'll talk about that in performance. Absolutely sharp and rough enough on the back to strike a ferro rod. Your other dimensions, okay, instead of a 5-inch blade, here you're getting a 4 1/4 inch blade, 10.5 centimeters. Yes, I'm looking down at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial. With a blade width at the base that is just a little bit narrower than the number 1 at 1 1/16 of an inch, 2.75 centimeters. The number 1 was 3 centimeters, but the same steel stock thickness, 2.8 millimeters. So let's go ahead and see how it performs, and then we'll compare it to the number 1 some more. Glacier. Fine carving with the Glacier. Yeah, that's nice. Good edge for this, comfortable grip. I want a little jimping on the back though, just for me. Yep, get up nice and close to it for fine work. Yeah. Sun comes out, the local airport kind of gets really busy. Yeah. Nice bite into the wood. Very good. Comfortable grip. Again, some jimping on the back would be nice, but just add that later. All right, let's try something a little bit harder. Nice. All right, this isn't the out-of-the-box edge. I've had this knife for a couple of months, put it to a lot of use around the house, food prep, other indoor tasks like cutting up packaging and things. Out in the yard for some light and heavy carving and some light chopping and delimbing. And yes, it's already been through all the testing. All I've done is refreshed it a little bit with some stropping, and in that I used a couple of strops I picked up from BeaverCraft. These are pretty nice value. Maybe we'll talk about them in another video. Shaving sharp, yes, on paper. Now this edge, I'm going to say, is steeper than the number one, so keep that in mind. But yeah, still very, very keen. Some cardboard. Yeah, really nice cutting tool. Really like these edges. So how did it do in the test? I'm going to say impressively well, starting with the most martial test, thrusting and stabbing first into my Pell, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target, and then to test into harder media straight in the redwood. I'm using a forward and reverse grip with the edge facing away from me and edge facing towards me. What am I looking for? Well, first, penetration into the softer media, and yeah, tip is not nearly as acute as the number one, so it meant more resistance, but when it penetrated, it made a pretty wide channel. Now, it might certainly meet resistance in trying to penetrate, well, more resistant material, so consider that. But I also, into that harder media, looking at tip durability, I would be more confident in the number two as being a more reinforced and less acute tip. I think you could take more abuse doing that, and it certainly held up to the testing I did. The other thing I'm looking for is how it translates that linear impact back into my grip, any uncomfortable collisions in any of those grips. No, it's a very comfortable grip, but also does my grip stay put? And surprisingly, yes, it did, but it depended on the grip, and that's a lot of it is about the grip shape and the bias. Now, as mentioned, it doesn't have nearly as deep a groove here to retain my hand, but it was more than enough to do the job. Forward grip, edge facing away from me. Yeah, my hand didn't go anywhere. Now into the harder media, I did default to sliding my hand down into more of a screwdriver grip, reinforcing the butt and the hollow of my hand, which is something I can't really do with the one because of those sharp corners. This one I can absolutely do that, and that came in handy edge facing towards me. I tried it first without. My hand stayed put pretty well into the soft media. I wasn't willing to try it with the hard media, so yeah, went down to screwdriver grip, made it work. Reverse grip, edge facing away from me. My hand stayed put really well. Didn't have to lock in the thumb. And I got a lot of power out of that. Turning the edge towards me though, yeah, I didn't feel like I had nearly as good a grip. The bias of this grip shape just really doesn't favor edge towards me as well as it does edge away from me, but we'll talk about that more in Marshall handling. Fine carving. I'm going to say with that edge angle, it's not quite as keen as the number one, but it did a fine job. Grip really comfortable, really secure. I can get a lot of leverage and control. Carving a little bit heavier, doing some, well, feather sticking, stake carving, things like that. Yeah, worked really well, and the edge held up. The only thing that I saw was more staining on that carbon steel blade. Doing some chopping. Now I have been using these to break down small branches if I don't have a heavier chopping tool handy. You can argue whether or not batoning is a real thing or just an internet fad. It's a shorter blade, so I had to stick to smaller media, but it was able to take that abuse, and when it came to splitting some small branches lengthwise, yeah, it did a perfectly fine job. Took no damage, and yeah, it actually feels comfortable under impact. If you've been following the channel, you know that before we get to my Marshall handling impressions, there's a couple of things we need to talk about, starting with that ideal balance between utility and Marshall usefulness for an all-around carry knife that can also help you with optics. Even in my country, there is a strong social and legal bias against anyone using an edged weapon for even the most justifiable self-defense. So being able to carry a tool that you can say you're carrying because it's a tool and it looks like a tool might help you out. And I'm going to argue that the Glacier looks more like a tool than, say, the Dune does. Just a little bit. But that also gets us to design and people arguing, it's not made for Marshall usefulness. Did BeaverCraft intend this knife to be used martially when they designed it? I'm going to say no, probably not. They describe it as being a field utility knife, and yeah, it's an awesome utility knife. But it is fundamentally a 4 1/4 inch fixed blade. And humans have a long history of, in a pinch, employing their tools as weapons. Even though your tool might spend its entire life as a tool, like that bow and arrow or rifle that mostly exists to get you dinner, in the right, or shall we say wrong situation, it might be put to defending your life or somebody else's, or in times of war, it might be applied to offense. Now, as we get into more civilized times and settings, that kind of situation hopefully comes up a whole lot less than it used to, but let's go ahead and talk about how a tool like this might be able to function for you in those situations that I hope you never experience. All right, finally, let's go ahead and talk about its Marshall potential. And yes, I'm going to compare it to the Dune and then give you my overall, which one do I like better and for what. But even though the Dune is longer, it's not significantly longer, so there really isn't a blade length advantage that's significant, and also blade weight. Neither one of these I'm going to consider slashing, cutting, even snap cutting, even though it moves very well for that, as the Dune does. as my primary attack. I might be able to use it to wound an exposed target or flinch to create a bigger opening, but since neither of these is one of these, basically a knife big enough to function as a short sword, yeah, my ability to cut and slash with it is going to take a back seat to what I can do with the tip. And that's where I'm going to have to give the Dune points for having, well, a pointier, a more acute tip. Now, the Glacier might be more durable depending on what it might collide with, but I can see where it would need more resistance getting through, well, resistant media. But I still feel like I can make good use of it in the forward grip for stabbing and thrusting. Now, it doesn't have nearly that kind of bias in the grip in the way it changes the angle of the knife between having the edge facing away from me versus towards me, but there is a little bit of that. So yes, having the edge facing away from me puts that tip a little bit more in line with my arm, rotating it back towards me. Feels like it's a little bit more of a right angle. I can get more around corners, get more of that cutting action in the stab, but then of course I lose anything I might have on, you know, a forward slashing stroke. And also, I do feel like I lose a little bit of grip security when I reverse the blade. But since this is a rounded butt, as compared to this, I feel a very comfortable screwdriver gripping the thing. So that is absolutely on the table for use. So yeah, I feel like I can make good use of it as a stabbing and thrusting tool. A little bit of use of it as a slashing tool. What about a reverse grip? All right. First, we got to talk about transitions, and the Dune, well, not only being longer, it's narrower up here, so made for a better finger twirl. Now, finger twirling is not a good technique. It's dangerous. You can lose control over the weapon very easily. It's a bad habit that I've been doing for a long time. I can pull it off with this knife, but yeah, it feels a little chunky between my stubby fingers, so I'm going to default to pinch flipping. And this knife pinch flips better than the Dune does because, well, the Dune had all these things in the way to snag on my stubby little fingers. Whereas this, being nice and rounded, no obstructions for me, and I still have those nice indexing points to find to be able to move the knife forward to reverse grip. It still does have enough bias in the grip to overcome one of the things that I don't like so much about pinch flipping, which is the way the blade reverses directions in the pinch flip as compared to the finger twirl. But as I mentioned in the Dune video, if there's enough bias in the shape of the grip, just simply gripping down on the grip allows me to pretty instantly rotate the knife into the desired orientation in either direction. Now, in the reverse grip, you have what I call the short blade paradox, where I feel like I have much more leverage and control, not only for stabbing, but also for being able to use a knife with a belly for slashing at close range. That actually, for me, makes it superior to something really big, where, yeah, that gets really awkward for me. I don't feel like I'm getting the leverage I could have over it for using the edge, and trying to get that tip on, especially at close range, could be a struggle. I've discovered that the transition point for awkward is when a blade gets to be over about 6-7 inches. For me, something 4 or 5 inches, or even maybe a little bit shorter, is ideal. I feel like I've got good control, get really good power in that tip, and I feel like I can get some really interesting leverage for creating an effective cut in a slash. Now, if I rotate the edge towards me, I'm not getting as much of an extreme shift as I did with the Dune, where, yeah, that recurve really pointed the blade back towards me. So I feel like I can make more use of this grip to get that cutting action or back cutting action in the arc of the stab or reverse slash. If I feel like my grip is getting insecure in this position, it is really easy for me to hook my thumb over that rounded butt in either orientation, where I really couldn't do that very well with the Dune. As for other tools on the table, Yeah, I've got enough sticking out the bottom of my grip. It is a full tang, could be an impact tool, but it's a rounded impact tool as compared to the pointy one that the Dune gave me. But as I've used these knives, final bottom line, if I was going to make a choice, martially speaking, I would probably give the edge to the Dune as being a better martial design in certain ways, but again, it's a close give and take depending on your own preferences and comfort zones. It's not a huge set of advantages, but for me, they're definitely there. For utility use, though, I find the girth and shape of the grip, the angle of the blade, to make the Glacier a better utility knife. Certain tasks, having that recurve can really help you with in cutting, and certain times that shape can get in the way. One area I've definitely found that's true is in food prep. I prefer a blade with a somewhat straighter profile for that job. But, alright, let's cut the conversation off here. We do have some other BeaverCraft knives to take a look at. Till then, we'll get our conversation going in the comments. Any questions you have about these knives, any other Scandi ground knives or Ukrainian-made knives or affordable utility knives that might have martial potential, keep all that coming. And as usual, thank you all so much for watching, liking the videos, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for, well, it's probably going to be another BeaverCraft.